So if you remember a while back, I made a video on the Star Wars Expanded Universe, or Legends if you want to call it that. Both names are valid. Anyways, that was more of an overview of the idea of the continuity and how I kinda missed it. Yeah, it's still there, I guess, and you could still, pay for the issues, buy them online. But I mean more so that I miss these characters and this continuity having continual stories and the canon being more definite. Assured. Yeah, sure, Lucas could come in and change it whenever he wanted, but these characters would still be there to some aspect, and now that isn't really as much the case, but that's okay. I'm not gonna act like Disney Star Wars has completely ruined the franchise. I actually think it's been pretty 50-50. But there still isn't a day that goes by that I don't miss the ever-present coolness that is Kyle Katarn. However, with the canon that has existed since the early 90s, you do eventually have to spread out the story. To some, the easy response is to go far back before any of the films could even imagine. And that era, the era of the Old Republic, is incredible. This video isn't about that era though. You see, when you go forward in time from something that has a powerful impact not just in our reality but in the narrative of the story, you can encounter a possible problem. How do you address the past? And how do you make a future out of that? I know on paper you could just send the story so far in the future that those 6 or so movies don't matter. But sometimes risks are important and even necessary to tell a story. But you always encounter that problem. How do you find your own way away from that founding text? Away from that legacy. You see what I did there? Okay, so to explain simply for those of you that aren't massive Star Wars EU dorks like I am, and yes, I am a massive Star Wars nerd. I'm that guy who could probably name all those little 𝔈𝔡𝔤𝔞𝔯𝔰 you're thinking about. And if you're wondering who my favorites are, it's Ben Quadinaros, Gazgano, Max Rebo, and of course 𝔈𝔕𝔕𝔕. He's a pet and a drug lord. But anyways, the different eras of the Star Wars EU, from the furthest back to the last, so that way we can have an understanding of whenever I say something you're not super confused. We have the Dawn of the Jedi era, which is before 36,000 BBY. Oh, and by the way, BBY stands for Before the Battle of Yavin, and ABY stands for After the Battle of Yavin. Or in simpler terms, how long something exists before Star Wars 1977, or how long something happens after Star Wars 1977, or Star Wars A New Hope if that helps you remember. Just to make sure we're all on the same page here, there's a lot of words that I'm going to be using for this section. After the Dawn of the Jedi era, we have the Old Republic, which is about 25,000 years to 1,000 years BBY. Then the Rise of the Empire era, or the Clone Wars era and anything involved with the prequels, which is about 1,000 years BBY to 19 years BBY. 19 years BBY being Revenge of the Sith, obviously. The Rebellion era, which is everything between Revenge of the Sith and Return of the Jedi. The New Republic era, which is about 5 years after the Battle of Yavin and 25 years after the Battle of Yavin, which 5 years after the Battle of Yavin is Return of the Jedi and 25 years after that. This is also the era where we get the Thrawn trilogy, which is actually the start of the EU. It's some of the first published things ever for it. Then we get the New Jedi Order, which is 25 years after A New Hope. And finally, the Legacy era, all the way at the end of the timeline, set 130 years after A New Hope. So we're pretty far out from there. Just far enough away to make a distance, but close enough to see the ripples from the original movies, on top of 2 different eras set after the original trilogy to consider when skipping an entire century. That makes me wonder though, how did the writers of this series go about making a whole new world out of one we've seen previously? Well, maybe it's time to get into the story itself. The stars, all spread out in front of you as you float in meditation, waiting for either your rescue or your death. This is where we find ourselves, at the start of this story. Cade Skywalker, a young boy raised by his single father, has witnessed the end of the Jedi Order. The Sith, working alongside the Fel Empire, arrived at Ossus, the homeworld of the Jedi, and slaughtered them. Cade, having just watched his father die protecting the younglings, feels something new. Not just anger, not just suffering, but hatred. He runs to his ship, wanting to kill as many Sith as he can. His master, 𝔈𝔱𝔞𝔯𝔰, a friend of his father, imparts final words as he passes. He tells him not to embrace those dark tendencies and allow him to pass on. Cade, in his desperation and anger, imparts his will on the Force and forces his master back to life. Before anyone can truly understand what was happening, Cade is gone. He flies out on his fighter and is immediately destroyed. Cade then floats in space, watching the world go by, the stars surrounding him as he waits for death. On the other side of the galaxy, on Coruscant, the Sith have overthrown the Emperor, 𝔤𝔤𝔞𝔯𝔰, and now Darth Cade, the leader of the One Sith, a new Sith order that has found a new way to persist, disavowing the old ways to form a stronger union, all under one Emperor. They have taken the Empire under their grasp, after defeating the Jedi and the Galactic Alliance, spilling the galaxy into a whole new dark age. And that's just the first issue of the series, the intro to everything. After this, we get a whole new take on Star Wars, something a bit darker, though some might call it edgy. The Jedi are spread across the galaxy, remaining hidden from the Sith's gaze. 𝔤𝔤𝔞𝔯𝔰, the supposed true Emperor, remains in hiding, grasping for any power he can, attempting to turn back over his former troops and generals back to him. And Cade Skywalker is alive. He denies any sense of his past, taking drugs to kill his connection to the Force, being raised by a pirate crew ever since that horrible day. Cade is a very complicated man. He's deeply traumatized by what happened to him, but he doesn't do anything to deal with it. It's just rotting away at him, making him play too close to the edge of the dark side. He rides on his ship, the 𝔈𝔡𝔤𝔞𝔯𝔰, with his friends 𝔈𝔱𝔞𝔯𝔞 and Delia Blue. Sin is Cade's closest friend, a man who's probably even more of a pirate than Cade is, a true swashbuckler, while also being incredibly wary of the Jedi. Delia is Cade's love, the woman he's loved for years. She's the emotional center of the group, keeping Sin and Cade in check and making sure they're okay. She's also the ship's mechanic, so she keeps them together literally too. The world we're dropped into is well detailed. It feels like there's so much to explore. Now yes, it does help that at the time of publishing, they had about 15 years of lore and other books to pull from. Books, comics, games. Yet they take a lot of this lore and spin it in fresh directions. John Ostrander is a writer that was working on the Star Wars EU for years, mostly in the Dark Horse comics, though most of his works were actually involved with the Republic era, as in the Clone Wars and the prequels, you get what I mean. And because of that, he was able to use a lot of the lore and things that he's introduced in those books, as well as works he's done with other people, to make a more unique and interesting setting. He even brings in elements of the EU lore I don't like and actually makes them work. The example that comes to mind is the Yuuzhan Vong. I didn't really like them when they were introduced. It's not that their stories were bad inherently, but the premise of a species of aliens that come from a completely different galaxy, coming into the Star Wars galaxy and trying to take it over is one thing. I can sort of accept that with some clever writing. But the fact that they're also undetectable in the Force and they are immune to most Force powers? Come on, that's such a cop-out. It feels like something more out of Warhammer 40k and not really Star Wars. No dissing to 40k, but those stories have completely different tones and styles. However, Ostrander focuses on one of the more interesting elements of the Vong, to make them more interesting and tied into the world, such as focusing on the damage they did to the galaxy during the war they had in the New Jedi Order era. The galaxy is still feeling the damage of their terraforming and bioweapons, and many Vong were hunted down and attacked, though they are also sought out for their bioweapons and scientific abilities. So while I don't care for their original premise, the way they're used here is pretty interesting. My only complaint I have about the story and setting is the fact that, yet again, there was a Jedi purge. Now, they do eventually add layers of this to make it take on the angle that the Sith were manipulating a scenario so they could have a governing power assist them in purging the Jedi. But there's so many times in the Star Wars EU where the Jedi get purged. It's like every century or so there's some other purge going on. Okay, that's a bit of an over-exaggeration. It's more like it happened 3 times, but still, that's 3 times they pulled the same trick. It can get a bit samey, you know what I mean? However, I'm willing to accept it because they get a lot out of it really fast, and we get to explore a great world and characters I enjoy. I also want to take a moment here to talk about the visual design of the Legacy era. Star Wars is probably one of the best series to prove that visual direction is just as important for creating a world, possibly even more than having a ton of lore. And I think the artist, or at least the main artist for most of these books, Jen Duursema, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, gets this down so well. She's actually a frequent collaborator with John Ostrander and worked with him again on a lot of the Republic era books. So she really takes this idea and kind of combines it with some of her elements of the original trilogy and making a whole new fresh concoction. And visually, it's just a treat. You could see in all the ships the echoes of that original trilogy, like I said, but there's also future improvements and developments on the TIE fighters and X-Wings. And yet they still have their own distinct looks. I especially love the Imperial Neutralizer class bomber. It just has this nice look. It's like this eyeball with triangles onto it. It's like they took the TIE fighter and made it more aerodynamic. Even the worlds keep a lot of that grunginess and dirtiness from the original trilogy, but with that distinct hint of Clone Wars era here and there. The most distinct looking faction, at least visually here, is definitely the One Sith. This is the Sith that they're most otherworldly, but also the most interconnected. Most of them are covered head to toe in red and black tattoos. Sith tattoos introduced by Darth Maul in The Phantom Menace. Okay, to us the audience, not the world. You get what I mean. Though, the few that aren't have this distinct look. Darth Krayt himself, looking like this terrifying monster, covered in this strange crustacean-looking armor. And he has this one red Sith eye and this cold blue eye. The Sith eyes have this explosive look to them, while his blue eye, which is apparently a 𝔈𝔡𝔤𝔤 eye, just looks so dead and lifeless. It's almost too placid. Then you have characters like Darth Nihil, who are these slim, slick figures who almost look like a Wraith equivalent to the Star Wars universe. All the Sith look so evil and I love it. Now, before I start talking about the characters, I should preface that I'm not going to talk about every single character, just the ones that I think are incredible standouts, are integral to the story, or I just think have good development. So, let's cut to the chase. Fuck Rowan Fel. I see people online act like the Fel Empire isn't that bad. Is it? I get it, they have their cool Imperial Knights, which are basically just kind of Jedis, but they became political soldiers or guardians. I guess it's the sort of Walmart brand of the Jedi, or the Imperial brand of the Jedi, if you guess. But I'm sorry, if you look at what Rowan Fel has done and does throughout the story, there's no way you could think the Fel Empire is a good thing. Fel is one of the most hateable characters I've seen in Star Wars. And that's a good thing. Yeah, I hate this guy. He's the man who will get away with doing so many horrible things and no one will question it, disguising himself in moral grandeur and a sense of superiority. Yet he was also dumb enough to trust a Sith. Okay, well, it's a bit more complicated than that, but I'm not going to spoil that. It's genuinely one of the most satisfying things I've read in years when this asshole finally gets what's coming to him. And I'm pretty sure this was an intentional choice, to show that it's not just the Sith that are evil, but that empires themselves are evil, corrupting forces that choose to hide behind morals and power. I mean, Lucas himself made that pretty apparent with his work on the films and series, but I digress. Fel is almost like a secondary villain to the whole story, and yet all the factions inevitably have to work with him because, well, they have to. Krayt's empire is just so vast and strong, they need to all band together. Ironic, since he, and those he worked closely with, are the reason that Krayt took over in the first place. Which leads me to Antares Draco, who I wasn't originally going to talk about, but his arc fascinates me. He is the leader of the Imperial Knights, at least at the start of the story, and throughout most of it, he is the typical good soldier, never questioning the Emperor, always speaking about his loyalty to Fel. Yet throughout it, he has these little moments of rebellion. Like when he disobeys and gets a small crew of knights to save his love, Marasiah. Oh, who, by the way, is the princess of the Fel Empire and Rowan Fel's daughter. Rowan Fel said, oh, don't save her. Now, he had political reasons, but it wasn't a great one. Though, he does stay mostly loyal until the very end. When Fel is off the deep end, Fel literally willing to genocide the people of Coruscant, which makes Draco confront him and kill him. Draco, like all the Imperial Knights, knows that while they serve the Emperor, the Force is a much greater calling. The Emperor became corrupt in himself, and they needed to stop him. Of course, I think now I need to talk about the main villain, Darth Krayt. On the surface, Krayt might seem like your stereotypical strong, stoic villain type, but you'll soon learn he's much more than that. Krayt wasn't always his name. His original name was 𝔕𝔞𝔯𝔞𝔯𝔰, a former Jedi during the Clone Wars and was actually a member of the Tusken Raiders on Tatooine. His father was also a Jedi, but he had to see him die in front of him. After that, he experienced Order 66, he lived long enough to be captured by the 𝔈𝔡𝔤𝔤, and he was tortured and experimented on. He was how they learned about the Force itself to begin with. And this taught him one thing. Power is all you need to survive. He learned the ways of the Sith from the ancient scrolls on Korriban, the original Sith homeworld, making a new way for the Sith to live. In a way, solving a lot of problems of the previous ways, but also making new ones. When reading through the story, my writer's sense is caught onto something super interesting. Cade is desperate. He doesn't want to die. He wants to find any way he can to live forever, to keep himself in power, manipulating everyone to keep him on the top. He's lived so long now and he wants to keep it that way. He's so terrified at the idea of his own death, of losing power, that he'll do anything to do it. These 𝔈𝔡𝔤𝔤 seeds that they placed into him when they were experimenting on him, eating away at his body, making him desperate to keep on living. He wants to live so badly that he'd even betray the way his father raised him. His selfishness corrupts the whole world around him. In a way, being one of the truest embodiments of the Sith ideal, or maybe the logical endpoint. Which leads us to Cade Skywalker. In many ways, Darth Crate's mirror, but in many ways his opposite. As said earlier, Cade experienced the third Jedi Purge, the one done by Cade himself. Cade should have died that day, but he didn't. Ever since then, whether he wants to acknowledge it or not, it followed him. Cade throughout most of the story is that young, angry, scared boy still floating in the stars, waiting to die. He denies his legacy every chance he gets, but eventually it will drag him, kicking and screaming, till he can find himself once again. Cade honestly might be one of my new favorite Star Wars characters. I know many people write him off as too edgy and not a real Skywalker, but really he's a reflection of the Skywalkers we've seen before. He has traits mostly relatable to Anakin of all people. His devil-may-care attitude, his aggression, and even his pain. Cade is selfish, he hurts those around him often due to his own actions. Yet the story never tries to paint Cade's selfishness as a good thing. They don't try to pull the whole, he's actually using both the dark and the light, that some writers try to do in the EU, and that's stupid because that's not how the Force works. They paint Cade's refusal to work on himself, learn the ways of the light side, and instead rely on the dark side as a pathway to self-destruction. Much like his drug abuse, they never paint it as, oh cool, let's get high. Instead, it's showing that he's just trying to escape away from confronting just who he is, to deny himself. Yet when it matters, Cade can't help his instincts to do good. He goes about it in messy ways, but he is a good man deep down. A good man with a lot of problems. Many times, Cade's selfishness does get in his way. He's afraid of that loss of others. He wants to make sure he can never feel that pain again. He uses the dark side to revive people back to life against their will, even betraying those he cares for. Which leads us to this beautiful moment where he can't use his dark side to save someone he loves. Delia, the woman who's been there for him all this time. And despite the fact that he's hurt her, cheated on her, and disappointed her so many times, she saw the good in him even when he didn't even see it in himself. So when the Sith develop a weapon with the 𝔈𝔡𝔤𝔤 that stops and even hurts those who use dark side abilities on Delia, forcing him to try and try and try, but she gets closer and closer to death every time he does it, he finally has to admit it. He can't be this anymore. He's finally acknowledging who he is and who he has to be and who he loves, embracing love instead of his desire. He holds her close and heals her, bringing her back to health. This time, not with senses of selfishness and need, but with care and love. This is the moment where Cade finally gets out of the shadow of Darth Crate, learning who he needs to be and correcting the mistakes Crate made. And thus, Cade goes on the warpath to fight Crate himself. And in his final moments to stop Crate from ever finding a way to revive himself, he tries to jump into a star. But in one last moment, Cade realizes he doesn't need to die to sacrifice himself. He has one more choice to make. Thus, he leaves the ship as it flies into the star and floats in space, watching the stars once again, like when he was a boy. But instead of being in pain, he's finally found peace. And mind you, these are just the 4 characters that I wanted to highlight. Star Wars Legacy is such a good comic series with so much political intrigue, double crosses, and so much more. If I made a video talking about everything I liked about it, we'd be here for literally hours. I mainly wanted to talk about the series because, like I said, I was kind of missing some of that expanded universe stuff I loved as a kid. But I always saw that people seemed to be pretty mixed about Legacy. I'd always heard about it, but I never looked too far into it. I guess it was just never at the library I always rented from. So when I saw so many people online calling this era edgy, weird, boring, and it's a spit in the face to the Star Wars series, it was the first thing I wanted to check out. Partly because, well, people are hyperbolic about anything revolving Star Wars these days. I'm glad to say that I was pleasantly surprised with a story that understands many of the core aspects and themes of Star Wars. The corruption of imperialism, the choices you make to find who you are, balancing yourself, and finding inner introspection. These are all aspects of the Star Wars saga that I've always loved. And to say Legacy doesn't have any of this? Well, I think that's a lie. Is it edgy? Yeah, sure, but Star Wars has always had its dark moments. You can't tell me you watched Revenge of the Sith and then complained that this was too edgy. Hell, Revenge of the Sith came out 1 year before Legacy started. In my eyes, Legacy is a nice, experimental, and defiant take on the Star Wars saga. And I wouldn't have it any other way. And yeah, that's all I really got to talk about with that one. I know you guys are probably thinking, hey, we voted on a poll. Why is this being the one you're covering and not the ones we voted on? That's because this video was already going to come out. I had already planned on making a video on this a while back, and I finally decided to pull the trigger. Don't worry, that video you guys voted on will come out. When? I don't know, but I promise it will come out. At least I'll try to make it come out. If it somehow doesn't end up going that way, then I'll let you guys know in a post or something like that. But I am trying to get it done, I promise. Of course, I'm still going to work on other stuff in the meantime too. I can't just do everything that everyone votes on, you know? It's mostly my channel, and if you guys are here for that, then you're here for that. And if you guys are somehow mad about it, though I doubt you would be, there's only like 5 of you, then, you know, that's okay. I'm sorry about that. But yeah, I really did like Star Wars Legacy, and honestly, I'd recommend checking it out. I did again spoil some things in this video, but I do think even with some spoilers, you can go into it and really just acknowledge how great it is. Again, I was kind of going in a little bit scared and iffy, but I liked it a lot, man. I thought it was pretty cool. Yeah, a bit edgy at times, but it's Star Wars. You know, Star Wars will always have a bit of its edgy moments, if you ask me. I mean, people love The Force Unleashed, so you know, you can't tell me this is too edgy and then Force Unleashed is over here. But with all that being said, I'll see you next time.